The scope crosshairs settled on a man who was about to die. Staff Sergeant Elena Cross didn't know it yet, not with certainty, but her instincts were screaming. Through the thermal imaging of her M40A5 sniper rifle, 2,000 meters across the Car Valley, she watched the heat signatures of 8 Navy SEALs moving toward a compound that looked too quiet, too still, too wrong. Her finger rested light on the trigger guard, waiting, watching. The way her father had taught her in the Nevada desert when she was 7 years old, standing on a milk crate with a .22 rifle that was almost too heavy for her small hands. "Patience, Elena," Elias Cross would whisper. "Let the mountain tell you its secrets." Tonight, the Afghan mountains were whispering warnings she couldn't yet translate into words. The afternoon sun beat down on Ridge 7734 like a physical weight. Elena had been in position for 6 hours already, since well before dawn, and she had at least 6 more to go before the SEALs would insert for their night operation. She didn't mind. Patience was her greatest weapon, more valuable than the custom M40A5 beside her, more reliable than the thermal scope that had cost the Marine Corps $43,000, more deadly than the 120 rounds of match-grade ammunition distributed between her immediate pouches and her ruck. Her spotter, Corporal Flynn Mercer, settled in beside her as the heat began its slow decline toward evening. He was 22, 3 years into his enlistment, and still young enough to believe that wars could be won cleanly. "SEALs are infilling at 2,300 hours, Mercer said quietly, checking his own equipment with the ritualistic precision of a man who understood that small mistakes led to large casualties. Elena nodded without taking her eye from the spotting scope. She'd been studying the compound all afternoon, a typical Afghan structure of mud walls and flat roofs, sitting in the valley floor like a tumor. Intelligence said it held Khaled Ahmadi, a Taliban commander responsible for 23 coalition deaths in the past 6 months. Intelligence said a lot of things. Elena had learned to trust her eyes more than analysts sitting in air-conditioned rooms 5,000 miles away. "Something's wrong down there," she said. Mercer looked through his own scope, studying the compound and the terrain around it. "Looks quiet to me. Maybe they don't know we're coming. That's what worries me." Elena shifted her position slightly, her body molding to the rocky ground like water finding its level. "Intel says Ahmadi has 5 to 8 fighters with him. I've counted 3 all day. And they're not acting like they're protecting a high-value target. They're too relaxed, too casual." Through her scope, she watched one of the Taliban fighters sitting in the shade, smoking a cigarette. Another was working on a motorcycle that looked like it hadn't run in years. The third had disappeared inside the compound an hour ago and hadn't emerged. 3 men. Not 5, not 8, 3. And the valley itself felt wrong. The Car Valley was a natural kill funnel, high ground on 3 sides, limited exit routes, the kind of terrain where ambushes happened, where entire units disappeared, the kind of place that showed up in after-action reports with phrases like catastrophic casualties and lessons learned. Elena keyed her radio, connecting to the Tactical Operations Center at FOB Chapman. "Overwatch to TOC, I have concerns about the target compound. Activity level is inconsistent with intelligence estimates." The reply came back after a moment, crackling with static and the flat certainty of men who made decisions based on screens instead of ground truth. "Copy, Overwatch. Intelligence stands. Mission is go." Elena bit back her frustration. She was a staff sergeant, not a general. Her job was to provide overwatch and eliminate threats, not to question the decisions of officers who had access to satellite imagery and signals intelligence, and all the other technological miracles that were supposed to make war scientific and predictable. Except war had never been scientific. It was chaos dressed up in acronyms and PowerPoint slides. She checked her rifle one more time, a ritual she'd performed 10,000 times until it was as automatic as breathing. The M40A5 was an extension of her body, customized over 8 years until every surface was worn smooth, every adjustment tuned to her specific needs. The stock fit her shoulder like it had grown there. The trigger broke at exactly 3 pounds of pressure. The barrel was cold hammered steel that could put 5 rounds into a quarter-inch group at 100 meters. In her hands, it could reach out and touch someone at distances that seemed impossible. She had 30 rounds in her immediate pouches, another 90 in her pack. Her M4 carbine lay beside her with 6 magazines, 180 rounds total. The Sig Sauer M18 pistol on her thigh held 15 rounds, with 2 spare magazines secured in her vest. If this operation went bad, and her instincts were screaming that it would, she was going to be the only thing standing between those SEALs and a very, very bad night. "If this goes sideways," she said to Mercer, not looking away from her scope, "we're going to earn our pay." Mercer nodded grimly. He'd been Elena's spotter for 18 months, long enough to learn that when she had a feeling about something, it was usually right. Overwatch snipers were often the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophe. They were the guardian angels, the invisible hand that reached across impossible distances to pluck death away from the men on the ground. In the distance, faint and far away, Elena could hear the first whisper of helicopter rotors beginning to beat the air. Team 7 was coming, and whatever waited in that valley, Elena Cross would be ready. But to understand why Elena was willing to risk everything for men she barely knew, you need to understand where she came from. Red Mesa, Nevada, 16 years ago. 7-year-old Elena Cross stood on an overturned milk crate, hands barely big enough to grip the scoped .22 rifle her father placed in them. The rifle was almost as long as she was tall. Gunnery Sergeant Elias Cross, United States Marine Corps, knelt beside her. 40 years old, face carved by desert sun and combat deployments, eyes that had seen things he'd never speak about. 2 tours in Desert Storm, one in Somalia, scout sniper. The kind of Marine other Marines told stories about. He'd raised Elena alone after cancer took her mother when she was 4. Raised her tough and kind at the same time. Taught her to hunt, to read stars, to treat the land like a map written in language older than words. "The rifle is an extension of your mind," he told her, voice steady despite heat that made Mirage dance across empty desert. "You don't aim at the target, you see the bullet's path before the trigger breaks. Count every factor, wind, distance, the earth turning beneath you. Trust the numbers, then let it happen." Tin cans lined a fence post 200 yards away. Impossibly far for a child. Elena missed 17 shots in a row. Elias never scolded, never showed disappointment, just knelt beside her, adjusted her cheek weld, guided her breathing, taught her to read wind in grass and mirage in glass. By sunset, she knocked down 12 straight, and something inside her aligned. Precision, patience, physics, 3 elements forming a single instinct. "Excellence isn't beating someone else," Elias said as the sun painted the desert red. "It's beating who you were yesterday." Elena grew up in that desert, learned to read the land like language, spent weekends with her father at remote ranges, practicing fundamentals until they became automatic. Breathing control, trigger discipline, wind estimation, the 1,000 small details that separated competent shooters from exceptional ones. Elias never pushed her toward military service, never demanded she follow his path, but the lessons were there, embedded in muscle memory and instinct, waiting for the day she'd choose what to do with them. When Elena turned 18, she enlisted in the Navy instead of following his Marine Corps footsteps. Not rebellion, strategy. The Navy offered paths for women who wanted to prove themselves in combat roles that mattered. She crushed basic training, mastered at arms qualifications, kept signing up for every tough school she could access. Close quarters battle, advanced long-range marksmanship, combat medicine. She collected qualifications like other people collected souvenirs, driven by a need she couldn't quite name. Elias watched her career with quiet pride, never doubted, never questioned, just offered advice when asked and stayed silent when she needed to figure things out herself. He died 3 years into her service. Heart attack while hiking the same Nevada desert where he taught her to shoot. They buried him with full military honors. Elena carried his rifle, the same .22 from the milk crate, and fired the final salute. After that, something hardened in her. Focus sharpened, purpose clarified. She pushed harder, trained longer, sought out the toughest assignments in most demanding schools, like proving herself to her father's memory, like showing him the lessons hadn't been wasted. But it was her brother Tyler who showed her what sacrifice truly meant. Fallujah, Iraq, 8 years ago. Tyler Cross, 22 years old, Marine rifleman, died trying to reach a wounded Marine bleeding out in the street. A Taliban sniper had them pinned. Tyler's team tried to recover his body but couldn't. The sniper position was too strong, the fire too heavy. It took 2 days before they could bring him home. 2 days that destroyed their family. Elena watched what those 2 days did to her father. The weight of knowing his son had died alone. That no one could reach him in time. Elias never spoke about it directly, but the pain was there in his eyes every day until his own heart gave out 2 years later. The doctors called it a myocardial infarction. Elena knew better. He died of a broken heart. At Tyler's funeral, 17-year-old Elena made a promise to herself. She would never let another family go through what hers did. If she had the power to bring someone home, she would, no matter the cost. That promise led her here, to this ridge in Afghanistan, watching over men she'd never met, ready to put her life on the line to make sure they all went home. Every single one of them. And 6 months ago, she'd learned exactly what that promise would cost. Jalalabad, Afghanistan, 6 months ago. The mission that changed everything. Elena and Mercer were providing overwatch for a joint task force operation near Jalalabad. It was supposed to be quick. Hit the compound, grab the target, exfil before sunrise. But intel had been dead wrong. The team walked into a coordinated ambush executed with precision that spoke of professional training and advance warning. Elena's position was a ridge 1,400 meters away, paired with her spotter. They were calling corrections, providing covering fire, doing everything right. Then their position got compromised. Taliban fighters had flanked them, were closing in from 3 directions. Elena and Mercer fought until their ammunition ran low, then ran out completely. They were pinned down, surrounded, about to be overrun. "Any station, this is Overwatch," Mercer transmitted desperately, his voice tight with fear he was trying to control. "We're surrounded, out of ammo, need immediate extraction." For a moment, only static answered. The assault team was pinned down themselves, taking heavy casualties. Nobody was in position to help. Then a voice came through the chaos, calm, professional, absolutely certain. "Overwatch, this is SEAL Team 7 Actual. Commander Marcus Daniels. We hear you, hold on, we're coming." Daniels led his team through hell to reach them, fought through an ambush, took fire from 3 directions, crossed 600 meters of open ground under machine gun fire, got to Elena and Mercer just as Taliban fighters were breaching their position. Mercer took a bullet during the extraction, through the shoulder. Would have been a kill shot if Daniels hadn't shoved him down a split second earlier. Daniels personally dragged him to cover, packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, carried him to the helicopter himself while bullets chewed up the ground around them. As they lifted off, the valley falling away beneath them, Daniels looked at Elena and said simply, "Marines take care of Marines. SEALs take care of everyone. That's how we all go home." That moment defined everything that came after. The debt she owed, the man she wouldn't leave behind. Elena got the compass tattoo 3 weeks later. Small, precise, professional. A reminder that some people were worth walking through fire for. That some debts could only be paid in blood and courage. Now, 6 months later, fate was giving her the chance to pay that debt. Night had fallen over the valley like a curtain. Elena settled behind her rifle, her body conforming to the rocky ground, becoming part of the landscape. Through her night vision goggles, the world was rendered in shades of green and black, an alien landscape of shadows and starlight. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees since sunset. Her breath came out in small clouds that she had to be careful not to let obscure her optics. Beside her, Mercer monitored the radio traffic, listening to the SEAL team's final preparations. In the darkness below, two MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters were racing toward the valley, flying low and fast, their rotors chopping the thin Afghan air with a rhythmic thunder that Elena could feel more than hear at this distance. She swept her scope across the compound one more time. Still quiet, still wrong. The three Taliban fighters she'd observed during the day had disappeared inside. No sentries posted, no security measures that she could detect. Either Ahmadi had the worst operational security of any Taliban commander in Afghanistan, or this was something else entirely. Elena's gut told her it was something else. Overwatch, this is Team 7 Actual. The voice came through her earpiece, calm, professional, with the slight rasp of a man who'd been shouting commands for 17 years. Commander Marcus Daniels. We're 2 minutes out from insertion. Confirm you have eyes on target. Elena recognized his voice immediately, the man who'd saved her life 6 months ago. Overwatch confirms, Elena replied, keeping her voice steady and professional. Target compound is quiet, too quiet. Be advised, activity level remains inconsistent with intelligence estimates. There was a pause. Elena could imagine Daniels in the helicopter, weighing her warning against the mission parameters, against the intelligence that said Ahmadi was in that compound, against the pressure from above to get results. Copy that, Overwatch. We'll stay sharp. The helicopters came in low over the dried riverbed that served as their landing zone, 300 meters from the compound. Even with her thermal scope, Elena could barely track them. They were dark shapes against a dark sky, visible more by the dust they kicked up than by any lights or heat signature. The SEALs fast roped down in perfect formation, 8 shadows flowing from the aircraft like water. Within 45 seconds, both helicopters had lifted off and disappeared into the night, their rotor noise fading to a distant whisper. Team 7 was alone in enemy territory. Elena watched them form up in the dried riverbed, saw them begin their approach toward the compound in a staggered column formation. Even at 2,000 meters, she could read their tactical discipline, the way they moved, the spacing between operators, the sectors of fire each man covered. They were good, very good. But good wasn't always enough. 18 hours earlier, Bagram Airfield. Commander Marcus Daniels stood in the briefing room, his weathered face illuminated by the glow of tactical maps projected on the screen behind him. At 42, he was one of the most experienced SEAL team commanders in Afghanistan, with 17 years of combat operations etched into every scar on his body. His call sign, Reaper, had been earned in Ramadi during the darkest days of the Iraq War, when he'd led his team through 73 consecutive missions without losing a single man. That streak had become legendary in the special operations community, but Daniels knew that in their line of work, legends could die in a single second of bad luck or bad intel. The men assembled before him were the best of the best. Lieutenant Brennan Hayes, his executive officer and second in command, stood near the front with his arms crossed. Hayes was 31, former enlisted who'd gone to OCS and proven that Mustangs could be just as good as academy graduates. Daniels trusted him with his life and had done so on more occasions than he could count. The rest of the team sat in folding chairs, their attention focused with the intensity of men who understood that details save lives. Garrett Pierce, their medic, who could perform field surgery under fire. Sullivan Wade, Sully to everyone who knew him, their communications specialist, who could call in air support or jam enemy communications with equal skill. Thatcher Brooks, their designated marksman, with an SR-25 rifle that he treated better than most men treated their wives. Cade Mitchell, their breacher, who could blow through any door or wall and had the scars to prove it. These weren't rookies. Every man in this room had been handpicked for SEAL Team 7 because they were exceptional at what they did. But even the best needed to understand what they were walking into. Daniels clicked to the next slide, showing satellite imagery of the target compound. "The structure is typical Afghan construction," he said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who'd briefed hundreds of operations. Mud walls, flat roof, single entrance on the south side. Intelligence suggests Ahmadi has between 5 and 8 fighters with him, but that number could be higher. He paused, letting his team study the images. These men knew how to read terrain, how to identify firing positions and escape routes, and all the hundred small details that could mean the difference between success and failure. "Overwatch will be provided by Marine Scout snipers," Daniels continued, clicking to the next slide. It showed the sniper team's position on Ridge 7734, approximately 2 kilometers northeast of the target, with clear sight lines into the valley. Among the photos was Staff Sergeant Elena Cross. Cade Mitchell leaned forward slightly. "That's the Marine from Jalalabad, isn't it, sir? The one you extracted 6 months ago?" Daniels nodded. He'd worked with Cross before, not just the Jalalabad extraction, but she'd provided overwatch on 3 previous operations. He'd seen her work up close, seen the way she moved through chaos like it was choreographed, seen her put rounds on target at distances that seemed impossible. "Staff Sergeant Cross will be our primary overwatch," he confirmed. "And gentlemen, I've worked with her before. She's the real deal. If things go sideways, she'll keep us alive." Hayes leaned over the terrain model set up on the table, a 3-dimensional representation of the valley built from topographic data. His brow was furrowed with the kind of concern that came from experience. "Sir, this valley is a natural kill funnel," he said, tracing approach routes with his finger. "High ground on 3 sides, limited exit routes. If they know we're coming, if this is a trap—" Daniels raised his hand, cutting him off. He'd been thinking the same thing since he first saw the mission parameters. The valley was tactically problematic, the kind of place where ambushes happened, where entire units got caught in crossfires and chewed to pieces. But they'd planned for that. They always planned for that. "Intel is solid," Daniel said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced himself. "Ahmadi doesn't know we've tracked him. The informant is reliable. He's provided actionable intelligence twice before. We go in fast, clean extraction, wheels up before dawn." He looked around the room at his team. These men had followed him through hell more times than he could count. They'd seen things that would break civilian minds. They'd made decisions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But they were still here, still willing to walk into the darkness, because that's what SEALs did. That's who they were. "Insertion time is 2,300 hours, Daniels continued. 2 Black Hawks will take us in low and fast. We hit the ground 300 meters from the compound. Approach on foot using night vision. Brooks takes overwatch position here." He pointed to a small rise overlooking the compound. "While the rest of us make entry. We're looking for Ahmadi specifically, but we secure any intelligence we can find. Hard drives, documents, phones, anything that might lead us to other Taliban commanders in the network." The briefing continued for another 30 minutes, covering contingencies and extraction protocols and rules of engagement and communication frequencies. Daniels had learned long ago that survival in combat came down to preparation and adaptability. You planned for everything you could imagine, then stayed flexible enough to handle what you couldn't. As the team filed out to gear up, Daniels felt that familiar sensation gnawing at his gut, that sixth sense that had kept him alive through countless operations. Something felt off about this mission, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. He thought about his wife, Kate, and his daughter, Lily, waiting for him at Camp Pendleton. Lily was 8 years old and wanted to be an astronaut. Before he'd left on this deployment, He'd promised to be home for her birthday, to read her "Good Night Moon" like he did every night when he wasn't deployed. Daniels had never broken a promise to his daughter. He wasn't about to start now. Ridge 7734, Carr Valley, 23:45 hours. Through her scope, Elena watched Team 7 move through the darkness like ghosts. They'd covered 200 meters without incident, using terrain and shadow to remain invisible. Even knowing where to look, she could barely track them. Mitchell was on point, his eyes scanning for tripwires or pressure plates that might indicate IEDs. Daniels moved in the middle of the formation where he could control the team and respond to threats from any direction. Hayes brought up the rear, constantly checking behind them to ensure they weren't being followed. Textbook movement, professional, careful. Elena's crosshairs tracked ahead of them, searching for threats. Her finger rested on the trigger guard, ready to move to the trigger itself in a fraction of a second if necessary. They were 50 meters from the compound when Mitchell suddenly raised his fist, the signal to freeze. The entire team went motionless, dropping into whatever cover was available. Elena's finger moved to her trigger as she scanned for threats through her scope. For 5 seconds, nothing happened. 10 seconds. 15. Then Elena saw it. A thin wire stretched across the path at ankle height, almost invisible even with night vision. Mitchell had spotted it just in time. But as she watched, Elena realized with horror that it was already too late. The valley erupted in a thunderclap of explosions that shattered the night. IEDs detonated in sequence, massive blasts that threw dirt and rocks 50 feet into the air. Through her scope, Elena watched the shock waves slam into the seals like physical punches. Her thermal imaging whited out from the heat of the explosions, leaving her temporarily blind. Then the machine guns opened up. Muzzle flashes erupted from positions she hadn't seen. Spider holes cleverly concealed in the terrain, bunkers dug into the hillsides, fighting positions in the compound walls. Tracers cut through the darkness like lethal fireflies, creating a crossfire that enveloped Team 7. This wasn't a Taliban hideout. This was a fortress, and they'd walk straight into a carefully orchestrated trap. Elena's training took over. Her rifle barked once, twice, 3 times, controlled shots at Taliban fighters who were maneuvering to flank the SEALs. At 1,100 meters, she dropped a fighter with an RPG. At 980 meters, she killed a machine gunner trying to set up a position. At 890 meters, she put a round through the center mass of a Taliban commander who was directing the ambush. She worked the bolt, acquired target, fired, over and over, falling into the rhythm she'd practiced 10,000 times until it was as automatic as breathing. Through her scope, she saw one of the SEALs go down, then another. The team was taking casualties, fighting desperately to break contact from a kill zone designed specifically to destroy them. And then she saw Commander Daniels. He was moving toward better cover when another IED exploded directly to his left. The blast picked him up like a rag doll and threw him sideways. Elena watched through her thermal imaging as his heat signature tumbled through the air, saw the bright flare of muzzle flash as a bullet punched through his shoulder, then another through his leg. He was airborne, falling, bouncing off rocks, disappearing over the edge of a ravine she hadn't even known was there, a natural crevasse hidden by darkness and smoke. No, Elena breathed. She swept her scope to the ravine, searching desperately through the thermal imaging. At first, she saw nothing. Then at the bottom of a 20-foot drop, she caught a heat signature. Smaller now, partially concealed behind a cluster of large boulders, but moving. Daniels was alive. Elena keyed her radio, her voice steady despite the chaos below. Overwatch to Team 7. Commander is down, fell into the northern ravine. I have eyes on his position. Multiple casualties. You are heavily engaged by at least 40 enemy fighters. Hayes's voice came back strained and desperate, with gunfire crackling in the background. We can't leave the commander. Where is he? Do you have eyes on? Elena's scope was already trained on the ravine. She watched Daniels drag himself behind the boulders, watched him apply a tourniquet to his leg with his one good hand. Even wounded and alone, the SEAL commander's training was taking over. "I see him," Elena reported, her heart sinking as she counted the Taliban fighters moving toward the ravine. "He's mobile but severely wounded. Northern ravine, approximately 70 meters from your position." She watched 3 SEALs break from cover, running toward the ravine under heavy fire. Elena provided covering fire, dropping 6 Taliban fighters in rapid succession, her rifle growing hot from continuous shooting. But there were too many. For every fighter she killed, 2 more appeared. She watched helplessly as one SEAL went down. Then another. The third made it 10 meters before being forced back by machine gun fire that chewed up the ground around him. Hayes's voice cracked with emotion. "Negative, negative. We can't reach him. We have to extract." The decision was tearing him apart. Elena could hear it in his voice, could imagine the weight of abandoning their commander crushing down on him like physical pressure. But it was the right decision. If they stayed, the entire team would be wiped out. The remaining members of Team 7 fought their way back toward the landing zone, with Elena dropping another 11 Taliban fighters to cover their withdrawal. Her shooting was beyond precise now. It was supernatural. Each shot found its mark despite impossible distances and moving targets. The rescue helicopters swooped in, their door gunners laying down suppressive fire. The SEALs scrambled aboard, some carrying wounded teammates. Elena kept shooting, giving them every second she could. Then the helicopters lifted off, banking hard to avoid RPG fire, and disappeared into the night. The valley fell quiet except for the shouts of Taliban fighters celebrating their victory. Elena kept her scope trained on that cluster of rocks where Daniels had taken shelter. She could still see his heat signature, faint but present. He was alive, alone, surrounded by enemies who were actively hunting him. She turned to Mercer, her decision already made. "Pack up our gear, we're moving out." "Staff Sergeant?" Mercer stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "I'm going after him." "That's 15 kilometers through enemy territory, alone. It's suicide." Elena was already breaking down her rifle, her movements precise and methodical. "6 months ago, Commander Daniels came into a hot LZ for me. Now it's my turn. The brass will never authorize." "I'm not asking for authorization." Elena looked at her spotter, her eyes hard in the darkness. "Tell Lieutenant Hayes I'm going on a personal reconnaissance mission. I'll be back by tomorrow." That gives him plausible deniability. She stood, slinging her rifle over her shoulder, the weight familiar and comforting. In the valley below, Taliban fighters were searching the ravines, hunting for the American commander they knew had fallen. They had numbers, they had position, they had every tactical advantage, but they didn't have Elena Cross. And Marcus Daniels was about to learn that when a Marine makes a promise, she keeps it, no matter what it costs, no matter how impossible it seems, no matter what. The Black Hawk's interior was slick with blood. Lieutenant Brennan Hayes sat in the vibrating cabin, watching the combat medic work frantically over Garrett Pierce, who'd taken shrapnel to his left arm and shoulder. Across from him, Cade Mitchell held pressure on a gash across Sullivan Wade's forehead, while Thatcher Brooks gritted his teeth against the pain of a bullet through his calf muscle. 4 wounded, 0 killed, but they'd left their commander behind. Hayes stared at his hands. They were steady, years of training saw to that, but inside everything was shaking. In 3 years of serving under Marcus Daniels, he'd never left a man behind. Never. The SEAL ethos was carved into his bones. Never leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy. And yet, the helicopter banked hard, and through the open door, Hayes could see the Car Valley disappearing behind them. Somewhere down there, Marcus Daniels was alone, wounded, surrounded by Taliban fighters who would torture him for information before they killed him, if they hadn't killed him already. The flight to Forward Operating Base Chapman took 19 minutes. It felt like 19 hours. When they landed, the base was a flurry of activity. Medical personnel rushed to the helicopter, pulling the wounded out on stretchers. Hayes refused help despite the shrapnel wounds in his side and the blood running down his face from a cut above his eye. He had more important things to do. He went straight to the command center, limping slightly, leaving a trail of blood drops behind him on the concrete. His uniform was torn and scorched. His face was covered in dust and powder residue. He looked like what he was, a man who just survived hell and left part of himself behind. Colonel Briggs was waiting in the Tactical Operations Center, his face grim in the blue glow of computer screens. Behind him, intelligence analysts were reviewing drone footage of the ambush, and Hayes could see the red heat signatures of bodies scattered across the valley floor. Taliban and American alike. "We're launching a recovery operation," Hayes said before Briggs could speak, his voice hoarse from shouting commands during the firefight. "Right now, we get air support, we go back in force, and we bring Commander Daniels home." The words came out with more force than he'd intended, but he was beyond caring about military protocol. His commander was dying in that valley, and every minute they delayed decreased his chances of survival. Colonel Briggs shook his head slowly, and Hayes felt his heart sink. "Negative, Lieutenant. The area is too hot. We sent a Reaper drone over the valley 30 minutes ago. There are Taliban everywhere, at least 60 fighters now, maybe more. They're searching for Daniels, and they've set up defensive positions expecting us to come back. Without confirmation that Commander Daniels is alive, I cannot authorize risking more lives on a recovery mission." "He's alive, sir." Hayes stepped closer to the map display, his jaw set. "I know Marcus Daniels. He's the toughest son of a bitch I've ever met. He survived the fall, he found cover, and he's waiting for us to come get him." But even as he said it, Hayes knew how it sounded. Like desperation, like denial, like a man grasping at hope because he couldn't face the alternative. Briggs put a hand on Hayes' shoulder, his voice softening in a way that made everything worse. "Chris, I understand what you're feeling. I do. But I have to think about the bigger picture. We've already lost good men tonight. I can't send more operators into a trap without actionable intelligence. If we get confirmation Daniels is alive, if we can develop a workable plan, then we'll talk. But right now the answer is no." He paused, and Hayes could see the pain in the colonel's eyes. "I need you to prepare to notify his family. His wife, Kate, and daughter, Lily, are at Camp Pendleton. They need to hear it from someone who knew him." Hayes felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Notify the family. That meant Daniels was being declared KIA, killed in action. That meant they were giving up on him. "Sir, with all due respect," Briggs cut him off with a raised hand. "That's an order, Lieutenant. Get yourself patched up, debrief your team, and prepare the casualty report. I'm sorry, I truly am." The colonel turned back to the tactical display, and Hayes knew the conversation was over. He walked out into the Afghan night, his mind reeling. The base was quieter now, the initial crisis response winding down. Soldiers moved between buildings with purpose. Helicopters sat silent on their pads. Somewhere in the distance, a generator hummed steadily. Hayes found himself sitting on a concrete barrier near the motor pool, staring at nothing, trying to process what had just happened. How could he call Kate Daniels and tell her that her husband was dead? Or worse, captured by the Taliban? How could he face 8-year-old Lily and tell her that Daddy wasn't coming home? Marcus Daniels had saved Hayes' life 4 times in 3 years. Once in Helmand Province, when an IED had flipped their vehicle, and Daniels had pulled him from the burning wreckage while under fire. Once in Kandahar, when they'd been ambushed, and Daniels had exposed himself to draw enemy fire away from Hayes' position. Once during a rooftop extraction, when Hayes had been hit, and Daniels had carried him 200 meters to the helicopter. And once during a close-quarters battle in a compound, when a Taliban fighter had gotten behind Hayes, and Daniels had shot him literally 1 second before he pulled the trigger. 4 times Marcus Daniels had stood between Brennan Hayes and death, and when Daniels needed him most, Hayes had left him behind. He put his head in his hands, and for the first time in his career as a SEAL, Lieutenant Brennan Hayes felt like he wanted to quit. Not just this mission, not just this deployment, everything. He's alive. The voice came from behind him, quiet but certain. Hayes turned to see Staff Sergeant Elena Cross standing there, still in her combat gear, her rifle slung over her shoulder, her face streaked with dust and camouflage paint. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but they were focused and determined in a way that reminded Hayes of Daniels himself. "Staff Sergeant," Hayes said, standing quickly despite his wounds. Military protocol demanded respect, even in the middle of a crisis. "I saw him fall," Elena said, stepping closer. "I saw him too, Lieutenant, through my thermal scope. I watched him fall into that ravine, watched him apply tourniquets to his wounds, watched him drag himself behind those rocks and take cover. He was alive 30 minutes ago when you extracted, and unless he's bled out since then, he's alive right now." Hayes studied her face, searching for any sign of false hope or wishful thinking. But Elena Cross was known for being brutally honest, almost cold in her assessments. If she said Daniels was alive, she believed it. "Command won't authorize a rescue mission," he said quietly, defeat evident in his voice. "Colonel Briggs says the area is too hot, too many enemy fighters. Without confirmation of life, he won't risk more operators." Elena nodded slowly, as if she'd expected this response. "I know, that's why I'm not asking for authorization." She pulled out a tactical map and spread it on the concrete barrier, using small rocks to hold down the corners. The map showed the Carr Valley in detail, every ridge, every draw, every piece of terrain within 10 kilometers of the ambush site. Elena had marked it extensively with notes and observations, the product of 4 months of Overwatch missions in this area. "I've done Overwatch on that valley for 4 months, Lieutenant, every single day, watching through my scope, memorizing terrain features, tracking enemy movements, learning patterns. I know every trail, every cave, every piece of cover. I know where the Taliban patrol routes are, where they cache supplies, where their blind spots are." Her finger traced a route on the map, showing a path that wound through the mountains, avoiding known enemy positions. "I can get to Commander Daniels." Hayes looked at the route, then back at her. "It's 15 kilometers through enemy territory. Alone. No support, no backup, no extraction plan if things go wrong. Staff Sergeant, what you're describing is a suicide mission." He wasn't trying to dissuade her. He was making sure she understood exactly what she was proposing. Elena met his eyes, and Hayes saw something there that reminded him of Daniels himself. An absolute unwillingness to leave anyone behind, regardless of the cost. "I'm a Marine Scout Sniper, Lieutenant. We train for exactly this kind of mission. Deep reconnaissance, evasion, survival behind enemy lines. I can move through terrain that would stop an infantry squad. I can navigate at night without electronic devices. And I'm the only person on this base who knows exactly where Commander Daniels is." She pointed to a spot on the map with absolute certainty. "He's here, in a cluster of 3 large boulders at the base of the northern ravine. I watched him crawl into a cave-like opening between the rocks. I saw him pull brush over the entrance to conceal himself. That's not a guess or an estimate. That's where he is." The certainty in her voice was absolute, and Hayes found himself believing her. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why are you willing to risk your life for a SEAL commander? You've done your job. You provided Overwatch. You got us out alive. You killed," he glanced at the after-action report on his tactical pad, "17 enemy fighters during the engagement. You've done more than anyone could ask. You don't owe Daniels anything." Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring at the map. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but carried the weight of old pain. 6 months ago, Mercer and I were compromised during a mission near Jalalabad. Taliban fighters surrounded our position. We were pinned down, out of ammunition, about to be overrun. She looked up at Hayes. Commander Daniels heard our distress call and led his team in to extract us. He didn't know us, didn't owe us anything, but he came anyway, fought through an ambush to get us out. Mercer took a bullet that would have killed him, and Daniels personally provided medical care during the extraction. Hayes remembered that mission. Daniels had come back with his uniform covered in blood, none of it his own, and had simply reported successful extraction of friendly forces, like it was routine. But more than that, Elena continued, I know what it's like to lose someone. My brother Tyler was a Marine. He died in Fallujah trying to save his squad. He didn't make it out, and his team had to leave him behind. It destroyed my family. Her voice tightened. Commander Daniels has a wife and a daughter waiting for him at Camp Pendleton. I won't let them go through what my family went through. Not if there's any chance I can prevent it. Hayes felt a lump forming in his throat. He understood now. This wasn't just about tactics or duty. This was personal for Elena, driven by a debt she felt she owed, and a tragedy she was determined not to see repeated. He looked at the map again, studying her proposed route. It was risky as hell, but it might actually work. If anyone could pull off a solo infiltration through enemy territory, it was Elena Cross. If you're not back in 36 hours, Hayes said slowly, making his decision, I have to report both of you as KIA. That's all the time I can give you before Colonel Briggs demands answers. 36 hours, Staff Sergeant. After that, I'll have to tell Daniel's family he's dead, and yours that you died trying to save him. Elena nodded, rolling up her map. 36 hours is plenty of time, sir. I'll have him back here in less than 24. She spoke with such confidence that Hayes almost believed her. Almost. I need to requisition some supplies from medical, she said. Blood products, antibiotics, advanced trauma supplies. Daniel's wounds are serious. Even if I get to him, keeping him alive long enough for extraction is going to be the hard part. Take whatever you need, Hayes said. I'll make sure medical doesn't ask questions. He paused, then extended his hand. Semper Fi, Staff Sergeant. Bring our commander home. Elena shook his hand firmly. Semper Fi, Lieutenant. Tell Colonel Briggs I went on a personal reconnaissance mission and will be back tomorrow. That gives you plausible deniability if this goes wrong. Hayes watched her walk toward the supply depot, her stride purposeful despite the fact she was about to embark on what might be the most dangerous mission of her life. He should stop her. He should report this to Colonel Briggs immediately. But he didn't, because sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the thing the regulations allowed. Sometimes you had to trust that there were still people in the world who believed in honor and duty and leaving no one behind, even when it meant walking alone into hell. Elena spent the next hour gathering her gear with methodical precision. Every item was checked twice, every piece of equipment tested and retested. In combat, small mistakes led to large casualties, and she had no intention of making any mistakes. Her M40A5 sniper rifle, cleaned and ready. The weapon she knew better than her own heartbeat. Her M4 carbine as backup, with 6 magazines of 30 rounds each. Her Sig Sauer M18 sidearm with 3 spare magazines. 600 rounds total across all weapons. Hopefully more than she'd need. A combat medical kit expanded with extra supplies. Tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, antibiotics, morphine, IV fluids, and 3 units of O-negative blood that she signed for personally, the medic's eyes widening when he saw the quantity. Planning a war, Staff Sergeant? Planning to save a life, Elena replied. 3 liters of water, high-calorie energy bars that tasted like cardboard but would keep her moving. Night vision goggles in her thermal scope. A survival radio for emergency extraction. Paracord, a knife, fire starter, and a small survival kit. Total weight, 43 pounds on top of her body armor and equipment. It was heavy, but she'd trained with heavier loads in the mountains of Nevada. During her advanced training, she'd carried 60 pounds for 20 kilometers, and still qualified expert on the range at the end. She could carry this 15 kilometers if necessary, and she would. At 4:58 in the morning, Staff Sergeant Elena Cross slipped through a gap in the perimeter wire that she'd scouted weeks ago during a previous patrol. The sentries didn't see her. She moved like a ghost, using shadows and dead zones in the security cameras. Within minutes, she was beyond the protective wire and lights of the base, swallowed by the darkness of the Afghan mountains. Behind her, FOB Chapman continued its normal operations, most personnel unaware that one Marine had just launched an unauthorized solo rescue mission into enemy territory. Ahead of her lay 15 kilometers of some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth, controlled by an enemy that outnumbered her 60-1. Elena didn't care about the odds. She'd made a promise to herself at her brother's funeral 12 years ago. She'd renewed that promise 6 months ago when Marcus Daniels had risked everything to save her. Marines don't leave people behind, not ever. The first 5 kilometers took her 90 minutes of careful movement. She stayed off the obvious trails, knowing the Taliban often booby-trapped them or watched them from concealed positions. Instead, she followed the ridgelines where the rock was solid and wouldn't leave tracks, where she could see potential threats before they saw her. Every 100 meters, she stopped completely, becoming as still as the stones around her, listening and watching. Patience was the key to survival in this kind of mission. Rush and you died. Take your time and you might just live. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute, the kind of black that swallowed light and sound. But Elena navigated with confidence born from 4 months of studying every ridge, every valley, every rock formation through her scope. She'd learned land navigation from her father during hunting trips in the Nevada desert, how to read terrain in the dark, how to move silently over loose rock, how to become invisible in open country. Those childhood lessons, combined with Marine training and countless combat operations, had transformed her into something more than a soldier. She was a ghost. At 6:30 in the morning, with dawn beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of gray, Elena spotted her first Taliban patrol. 4 fighters moving along a trail about 300 meters below her position. They were talking loudly, laughing, their weapons slung casually over their shoulders. Undisciplined, Elena thought. They weren't expecting anyone to be out here. She froze in place, her desert camouflage and positioning breaking up her outline against the rocks. Even if one of the fighters looked directly at her position, his eyes would slide past without registering the human shape. The patrol passed within 20 meters of her position, so close she could smell their cigarette smoke and hear their conversation in Pashto. One of them was complaining about the cold. Another was talking about his family in Pakistan. They were young, maybe early 20s, and Elena felt a strange mix of emotions watching them. These were enemy fighters, men who would kill her without hesitation if they discovered her. But they were also someone's sons, someone's brothers. War was complicated that way. After they passed, Elena remained motionless for another 10 minutes, making sure they hadn't left anyone behind to watch their back trail, a common Taliban tactic. Only when she was certain did she continue moving. The sun was rising now, which meant she needed to find a hide position soon. Moving during daylight was exponentially more dangerous, but she'd planned for this. 2 kilometers ahead was a cluster of rocks she'd identified during her Overwatch missions, a natural formation that would provide concealment and a view of the surrounding terrain. She reached the hide position at 7:15, just as the sun cleared the mountains and flooded the valley with harsh morning light. The rocks formed a small, cave-like shelter, barely large enough for one person, but perfectly positioned. Elena crawled inside, arranged loose stones to conceal the entrance, and settled in to wait out the daylight hours. From this position, she could see 3 kilometers in every direction. Through her spotting scope, she could see the valley where Daniels had fallen. Taliban fighters were everywhere. She counted at least 25 in visual range, with certainly more beyond the ridgelines. They were conducting a systematic search, moving in teams of 3 or 4, checking every cave, every cluster of rocks, every potential hiding place. They knew a high-value target was down there, and they were determined to find him. The question that kept Elena awake despite her exhaustion: had they already found Daniels? She pulled out a protein bar and forced herself to eat, though she had no appetite. Her body needed fuel for what was coming. She drank water sparingly. She had 3 liters, but in this heat, that wouldn't last long. As the day heated up, the temperature inside her rocky hide climbed to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Sweat soaked through her uniform, and she had to fight the urge to drink more water. Discipline. That's what separated survivors from casualties in this environment. At 14:30 hours, Elena saw something that made her heart race. A Taliban patrol was working its way along the northern ravine, the exact ravine where Daniels was hiding. She put her eye to her scope and watched them search, moving slowly, methodically, checking every potential hiding spot. They were getting closer to Daniels' position. 600 meters, 500, 400. Elena ranged the lead fighter, 647 meters, a shot she could make in her sleep. But if she fired, every Taliban fighter in the valley would know she was here. Through her scope, she could see the cluster of 3 boulders where Daniels was concealed. No movement, no sign of life. Was he still alive? Had he already died from his wounds? The Taliban fighters were 300 meters away now, working methodically toward his position. Elena's finger rested on her trigger. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. 200 meters. She could engage. She could drop this patrol right now. But the consequences would be catastrophic. Every fighter in the valley would converge on her position within minutes. 150 meters. Then, like a miracle, the lead fighter's radio crackled to life. Elena could hear it through her directional microphone. Urgent voices, someone calling them back to the compound for a leadership meeting. The fighters looked frustrated but turned around, moving away from Daniel's position. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Daniels had just gotten incredibly lucky. But luck only lasted so long. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Elena prepared to move. She'd studied Daniel's position all day through her scope, planning her approach down to the meter. At 19:45 hours, as darkness settled over the mountains, Elena emerged from her hide. She'd been motionless for 12 hours, and her muscles screamed in protest. But she pushed through it. She had 8 kilometers left to cover, and most of it was through the heart of enemy-controlled territory. She moved down from the ridgeline into the valley, using every bit of cover, every shadow, every depression in the ground. The descent was treacherous. The slope was steep and covered in loose scree that could give away her position with one careless step. She moved at a glacial pace, testing each foothold before committing her weight, controlling her breathing to stay silent. It took her 45 agonizing minutes to cover just 300 meters down the slope. Above her, she could see the glow of Taliban campfires dotting the hillsides. Below her, the valley floor was dark, except for occasional flashlight beams as sentries made their rounds. At 21:30 hours, Elena reached the valley floor and faced her most dangerous challenge yet, crossing 500 meters of open ground to reach Daniel's position. The cluster of boulders was clearly visible in her night vision, but Taliban fighters were camped on 3 sides, with sentries patrolling irregularly. She'd have to time her movement perfectly, slipping between their patrol routes during the gaps in their coverage. She waited and watched, counting the interval between patrols. 7 minutes. That's how long she had to cover 500 meters of open ground without being seen or heard. It should have been impossible, but Elena had learned something during her years as a Marine. Nothing was impossible if you were willing to move slowly enough. She began her crossing, moving in short bursts timed to the sentry's movements, freezing completely when anyone looked in her direction. Her positioning and patience helped break up her outline, but out here in the open, it was more about timing than camouflage. Halfway across, at the 250-meter mark, Disaster nearly struck. A Taliban fighter emerged from a spider hole she hadn't known was there, appearing just 15 meters to her left. Elena dropped flat instantly, her face pressed into the dirt, not daring to breathe. The fighter lit a cigarette, and in the brief flare of the match, she could see his face clearly. He was young, no more than 19, with a wispy beard and tired eyes. He stood there smoking for what felt like an eternity, looking out over the valley, completely unaware that an American Marine sniper was lying motionless 15 meters away. Elena's hand was on her knife. If he took 2 steps in her direction, she'd have to kill him silently. The thought made her sick, but she'd do it. She'd do whatever it took to reach Daniels. The fighter dropped the cigarette, ground it out with his boot, and disappeared back into his spider hole. Elena waited 5 full minutes before moving again, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard it felt like it would break through. That had been too close, way too close. But she was committed now. There was no going back. She continued her crossing, and at 22:47 hours, she finally reached the cluster of boulders where Daniels was hidden. "Commander Daniels," she whispered into the darkness between the rocks. No response. Fear gripped her heart. Was she too late? Had Daniels died while she was crossing the valley? She crawled closer, rifle ready in case it was a trap, in case the Taliban had already found him and were using his position to ambush anyone who came looking. "Commander Daniels, it's Staff Sergeant Cross, Marine Scout Sniper. I'm here to bring you home, sir." Still nothing. Elena pulled out a small red lens flashlight. Red light preserved night vision better than white, and risked a brief flash into the cave-like opening between the boulders. In that split second of illumination, she saw him. Marcus Daniels was wedged deep between the rocks, his uniform soaked with blood, his face pale as death. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and irregular. For a terrible moment, she thought she was looking at a corpse. Then his eyes flickered open, unfocused and confused, struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. "Who?" he croaked, his voice barely audible. His lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, his skin hot to the touch with fever. Elena moved closer, her medical training taking over. "Staff Sergeant Elena Cross, Marine Scout Sniper. I'm here to bring you home, sir, but I need you to stay quiet and stay still while I work." She pulled out her medical kit and went to work immediately, cutting away his uniform to expose the wounds. The shoulder wound had gone straight through the deltoid muscle, painful and debilitating, but not immediately life-threatening if she could prevent further infection. But the thigh wound made her stomach drop. The bullet had shattered his femur, and she could see bone fragments visible through the damaged tissue. The area around the wound was hot, red, and swollen, clear signs of infection. Without proper surgical intervention, Daniels would lose the leg. Without any intervention at all, the infection would spread to his bloodstream, and he'd be dead within 24 hours. She'd gotten here just in time. "This is going to hurt like hell, sir," Elena warned, then irrigated both wounds with sterile saline solution. Daniels bit down on his own glove to keep from screaming, his body going rigid with pain. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool night air. Elena worked quickly but carefully, packing both wounds with hemostatic combat gauze impregnated with antibiotics. She gave him a shot of broad-spectrum antibiotics, probably not enough given the severity of the infection, but it was all she had. Next came morphine for the pain. She carefully calculated the dose, enough to take the edge off, but not so much that it would suppress his breathing or knock him unconscious. She needed Daniels alert enough to follow instructions when they had to move. She started 2 IVs, one in each arm, and hung bags of fluid mixed with electrolytes from a protruding rock. His body desperately needed hydration. "We need to stay here until tomorrow night," Elena explained quietly, forcing Daniels to drink water from her canteen. "Too many enemy fighters out there to move during daylight. I counted over 60 Taliban in the valley, and they're actively searching for you. Moving now would be suicide for both of us." Daniels grabbed her wrist with surprising strength for someone in his condition. His eyes were clearer now, the morphine and fluids already starting to help. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice stronger. "You've compromised your position. Now we're both going to die here." There was no accusation in his voice, only resignation and a hint of regret that someone else had been put at risk for his sake. Elena met his eyes steadily. "With all due respect, Commander, Marines don't leave people behind. My brother taught me that before he died in Fallujah. You're not dying here, and neither am I. We're both getting home." She spoke with absolute conviction, as if she could will it to be true through sheer determination. Daniel's memory was surfacing through the fever. 6 months ago, Jalalabad, you and Mercer. "You came into a hot LZ for 2 Marines you didn't know," Elena confirmed. "Fought through an ambush to get us out. Mercer took a bullet. You gave him medical care yourself. You told me, 'Marines take care of Marines. SEALs take care of everyone. That's how we all go home.'" She pulled out her thermal blanket and covered Daniels with it, both to keep him warm and to mask his heat signature from any thermal optics the Taliban might have. "Now it's my turn to make sure you go home, sir." Daniels was quiet for a moment, then spoke softly. "Kate, my wife, I told her I'd be home for Lily's birthday. She's 8, wants to be an astronaut." His eyes were unfocused again, the fever talking. "Can't break promises to my daughter." Elena positioned herself at the entrance to their hiding spot, her rifle at the ready, scanning the darkness for threats. "You won't, Commander. I promise you that." In the distance she could hear voices, Taliban fighters talking, moving around their camps. They were close. Too close. She checked her watch. 23:15 hours. Dawn was 8 hours away. 8 hours of sitting in the dark, hoping they wouldn't be discovered, keeping Daniels alive, and preparing for whatever came next. Behind her, Daniels drifted in and out of consciousness, the morphine and exhaustion taking their toll. In his fevered dreams, he saw Kate's smile and Lily's laugh. He saw his house in California with jasmine blooming in the yard. He also saw Elena Cross, this Marine he barely knew, who had walked alone through enemy territory to save his life. And he made himself a promise. If they got out of this alive, he would spend the rest of his life making sure her sacrifice meant something. In the darkness, Elena heard footsteps approaching. Her finger moved to her trigger, and she prepared to do what she'd been trained to do. Hunt, survive, protect the man behind her, no matter the cost. The footsteps grew louder, crunching over loose gravel and rocks. Elena could hear at least 4 distinct sets of boots, moving with the casual confidence of men who believed they owned this valley. Through the narrow gap in the rocks that served as her firing position, she could see flashlight beams sweeping back and forth, searching. Her eye was pressed to her rifle scope, her breathing controlled and steady despite her racing heart. Behind her, Daniels was semi-conscious, his labored breathing the only sound in their small sanctuary. The Taliban patrol moved into view. 4 fighters, young men in their 20s, wearing a mix of traditional Afghan clothing and tactical gear scavenged from dead coalition soldiers. They carried a K-47s with casual familiarity, and one had an RPG launcher slung across his back. They were talking in Pashto, their voices carrying in the still night air. Elena's Pashto was limited, but she caught enough words to understand. They were talking about the American they knew had fallen into this ravine, about the reward their commander had promised to whoever found him. 15 meters away, Elena's rifle was aimed at the lead fighter, center mass. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, taking up the slack. 4 targets, maybe 3 seconds to engage them all. The first shot would be the easiest, while they were still unaware. The second and third would be reactive shots as they scattered. The fourth would be the challenge, likely running for cover or returning fire. But she could do it. She'd engaged multiple targets faster than this during training. 10 meters. She could see their faces now in the ambient moonlight. The lead fighter had a thick beard and a scar across his left cheek. He was looking at something on the ground, Daniel's blood trail from 2 days ago. The rain hadn't been enough to completely wash it away. He said something to his companions, his voice sharp with excitement. He'd found something. 5 meters. The lead fighter stopped directly in front of the cluster of rocks, so close Elena could have reached out and touched the barrel of his AK-47. He was studying the ground carefully, following the blood trail with his flashlight. Behind her, Daniels shifted slightly, and Elena prayed he wouldn't make a sound. The fighter raised his rifle, chambering around with a distinctive metallic click that echoed off the rocks. This was it, the moment of decision. Elena centered her red dot sight on the fighter's chest, directly over his heart. One squeeze of the trigger, and 4 men would be dead in less than 4 seconds. But the consequences would be catastrophic. Every Taliban fighter within 5 kilometers would hear the shots. They'd descend on this position like a swarm, and she and Daniels would be trapped with limited ammunition and no escape route. 3 meters. The fighter was reaching toward the rocks now, his hand extending to move aside a piece of brush that partially concealed the entrance. Elena's world narrowed to the simple geometry of survival. Target, sight, trigger. Her finger began the final pressure that would send a bullet through the man's chest. Then his radio suddenly erupted with static and urgent voices. The fighter stopped, pulled back his hand, and grabbed his radio. A harsh voice was barking orders in rapid Pashto. Elena caught keywords: compound, meeting, commander wants everyone. The fighter responded, clearly frustrated, gesturing at the rocks as if arguing that he'd found something. But the voice on the radio was insistent, brooking no argument. Finally, the fighter spat on the ground in disgust, said something to his companions, and turned away. Elena watched through her scope as the 4-man patrol moved back down the ravine, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness. She didn't move, didn't even breathe properly for a full 5 minutes after they disappeared. Her fingers slowly released the pressure on the trigger, and she became aware that her hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline dumping from the near contact. That had been close, closer than anything in her 5 years of combat deployments. That was too close, Daniels whispered behind her, his voice hoarse but coherent. The morphine had worn off enough for him to be aware of what had just happened. Elena turned to check on him and was alarmed by what she saw in the dim light. His color was worse than before, a grayish pallor that spoke of severe blood loss and systemic infection. His breathing was rapid and shallow, and when she touched his forehead, his skin was burning up. The fever was spiking despite the antibiotics she'd given him. She checked his wounds, changing the dressings with practiced efficiency. The shoulder wound looked relatively stable, but the thigh wound was getting worse. The infection was spreading, red lines of lymphangitis radiating up his leg, a clear sign that bacteria were moving through his lymphatic system toward his bloodstream. If that happened, sepsis would follow, and then multiple organ failure. Without intravenous antibiotics and surgical debridement, Marcus Daniels had maybe 24 hours left, maybe less. Dawn was still 3 hours away when Elena made the decision that would change everything. She'd been monitoring Daniels' condition through the night, watching the infection spread despite her best efforts. The red lines creeping up his thigh were like a countdown timer, visual proof that his body was losing a battle she couldn't fight with the limited supplies in her medical kit. "How bad is it?" Daniels asked, reading her expression even through the fever haze. Even wounded and delirious, the SEAL commander could assess tactical situations, and his own medical condition was very much a tactical situation. Elena considered lying, offering false hope, but Marcus Daniels deserved the truth. "The infection is spreading faster than I can control it with the antibiotics I have. You need a hospital, surgery, strong IV antibiotics delivered directly into your bloodstream. You need it soon or—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Daniels nodded slowly, understanding. He tried to sit up, his face contorting with pain and effort. "Then we need to move, now. Get out of this valley before I can't walk anymore. While I can still help, still fight if necessary, Elena shook her head firmly. Sir, there are over 60 Taliban fighters in this valley. Moving during daylight would be suicide. Even at night, carrying you through that terrain. Staff Sergeant, listen to me. Daniels grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. I'm a dead man if we stay here. That patrol will be back. Next time they'll search more carefully. We need to move while I can still contribute, while I'm an asset instead of a liability. Elena looked out at the valley, calculating distances, routes, enemy positions. Daniels was right about one thing. Staying here was becoming untenable. But moving was incredibly dangerous, especially with a wounded man who could barely sit up. She pulled out her survival radio and made the decision she'd been avoiding. Keyed it to the emergency frequency and sent a burst transmission. Overwatch to base. Package alive but critical. Position compromised. Extraction impossible from current location. Will hold as long as possible. The response came back within seconds, and Elena recognized Lieutenant Hayes' voice immediately. Tense, worried, barely controlled. Copy, Overwatch. What's your situation? Can you move to alternate extraction point? Elena looked at Daniels, then back at the radio. Negative. Package is non-ambulatory. Multiple enemy patrols active in area. Request immediate quick reaction force. There was a long pause, and Elena could imagine the chaos her request was causing back at FOB Chapman. She imagined Hayes fighting with Colonel Briggs, arguing for an unauthorized rescue mission, putting his career on the line. Behind her, Daniels was trying to sit up, despite the agony it caused him. Elena, he said, using her first name for the first time, you need to leave me. Take my sidearm, my grenades, and go. I'll hold them off as long as I can. Give you time to get clear. Elena turned to look at him, this legendary SEAL commander who was willing to sacrifice himself so she could live. That's not happening, sir. We're both getting out of here, or neither of us is. The determination in her voice left no room for argument. 6 months ago, you came into a hot landing zone to extract me and Mercer, she continued. You didn't leave us behind then. I'm not leaving you behind now. That's not who Marines are. That's not who I am. The radio crackled to life again, and Hayes' voice came through with an edge of steel that Elena recognized as a man who'd made a decision. Overwatch, this is Hayes. We're coming for you. Mark your position and prepare for extraction. ETA 90 minutes. Relief flooded through Elena, but it was immediately tempered by cold, tactical reality. 90 minutes was an eternity when you were surrounded by enemy fighters, and once those helicopters appeared, every Taliban in the valley would converge on this position. Copy that, Elena transmitted. Be advised, landing zone is extremely hot. I count 60+ enemy fighters in the valley. You'll be coming into a hornet's nest. She pulled out her infrared strobe, a device visible only through night vision goggles, and set it up on the rocks above their position. That would mark their location for the incoming rescue force, but it would also pinpoint exactly where they were if any Taliban had night vision equipment. A calculated risk. Everything now was calculated risk. She turned back to Daniels and began preparing him for extraction. Another dose of morphine, stronger this time, because the pain of moving was going to be excruciating. Started a third IV bag. His body needed every advantage she could give it. She pulled out her remaining ammunition and did a count. 32 rounds left for her M40A5 sniper rifle. 4 magazines for her M4 carbine, totaling 120 rounds. 3 magazines for her sidearm with 15 rounds each, 45 total. Combined, she had 197 rounds. If this became a sustained firefight, she'd run out fast. Daniels was watching her work, his eyes clearer now despite the fever. He pulled out his own Sig Sauer pistol with his good hand, checking the chamber. Despite everything, the wounds, the fever, the infection, the warrior in him was coming back to life. How many enemy fighters did you say? 60+, Elena confirmed, checking her rifle's optics one more time. Spread throughout the valley in groups of 4 to 6. When those helicopters come in, they're all going to converge on us. Daniels managed something that might have been a smile. Then we'd better make every shot count. Elena moved back to her firing position and scanned the valley through her rifle scope. In the distance, she could see Taliban fighters moving around their campfires, completely unaware that in 90 minutes, 2 American helicopters would be screaming into this valley. She began identifying targets, ranging them, noting their positions. The ones closest to their position would be her first priority. They'd reach the landing zone fastest and posed the immediate threat. Time crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every minute felt like an hour. 60 minutes until extraction. 55. 50. At 45 minutes out, she began to hear a change in the valley. Voices were getting louder, more animated. Flashlights were moving with more purpose, more coordination. Had they been discovered? Then she saw why. A Taliban commander was moving through the camps, rallying fighters, pointing in the direction of their position. He was shouting orders, organizing a search. "We've got a problem," Elena said quietly. "They know we're here." Daniel struggled to a sitting position, despite the pain. "How many coming?" Elena scanned with her thermal scope, counting heat signatures. "I see at least 20 moving toward us, more behind them." She keyed her radio. "Hayes, be advised. Enemy fighters are converging on our position. They know we're here. You need to come now." "We're 30 minutes out," Hayes responded, his voice tight. "Can you hold?" Elena looked at the approaching Taliban fighters, then at Daniels, who could barely sit up, then at her ammunition count. "We don't have a choice, sir. We'll hold as long as we can." She switched her radio to the team frequency. "When you come in, come hot and fast. We'll be in a firefight by the time you arrive." She helped Daniels check his pistol magazines one more time, made sure he had grenades within reach. 30 minutes, Commander, then we go home." The Taliban were 400 meters away now, enclosing. Armed men moving with purpose, knowing their prey was cornered. Elena settled her rifle on its bipod, controlled her breathing, and whispered the prayer her father had taught her before every hunt in the Nevada mountains. Steady hand, clear eye, true shot. Then she waited for the enemy to come within range. The longest 30 minutes of her life had just begun. The Taliban advance was methodical, professional. These weren't untrained farmers with rifles. They moved with the tactical discipline of men who'd been fighting for years, who'd learned hard lessons from countless battles with coalition forces. 300 meters, 250. Elena tracked the lead fighter through her scope, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. Not yet. Every second she waited was another second closer to extraction. Another second the rescue helicopters drew nearer. Behind her, Daniels had dragged himself into a better position. His pistol held steady despite the tremor in his hands from fever and pain. They were back to back now, a Marine and a SEAL making their final stand in a pile of rocks in Afghanistan. At 200 meters, the decision was made for her. One of the Taliban fighters shouted something and pointed directly at their position. Someone had spotted the IR strobe, or seen movement, or simply gotten lucky. The group broke into a run, weapons raised. Elena exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and 200 meters away, the lead fighter dropped like a puppet with cut strings. She worked the bolt smoothly, muscle memory from 10,000 repetitions, acquired her second target. Fire. A fighter with an RPG went down. Third target. Fire. A man raising his AK-47 crumpled to the ground. The valley erupted in chaos. Taliban fighters scattered, diving for cover, trying to identify where the shots were coming from. But Elena kept firing, her movements mechanical and precise, each shot carefully aimed despite the rapidly developing firefight. Fourth shot, miss. The target dove behind a rock just as she squeezed the trigger. Fifth shot, hit, center mass. Sixth shot, hit, headshot on a fighter trying to set up a machine gun position. Her rifle was an extension of her will, each shot carefully placed, each target carefully selected. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd spent 8 years perfecting. Return fire began snapping overhead. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks with bright sparks and whining sounds that spoke of near misses. A PKM machine gun opened up from somewhere to the east, its heavy rounds chewing up the ground around their position. Daniels fired his pistol at a fighter who'd gotten within 50 meters. The sharp crack of 9mm joined the chaos. The fighter went down, and Daniels immediately shifted his aim to another target. Despite his wounds and fever, despite everything, muscle memory and training had taken over. 25 minutes, Elena shouted over the gunfire, keeping Daniels updated on their timeline. She dropped another fighter at 180 meters, then another trying to flank from the east. Her bolt worked like a machine, smooth, fast, reliable. But she was burning through ammunition faster than she'd planned. 15 rounds left in her sniper rifle. She'd have to switch to her M4 soon, which meant less accuracy at distance, but faster follow-up shots. The Taliban were getting smarter now, using cover and concealment, advancing by fire and movement. Elena could see their tactics evolving in real time. They were setting up a base of fire while others maneuvered closer. Professional soldiers would recognize it as standard small unit tactics. She shifted her aim to a machine gun team setting up 250 meters away, fired twice quickly. Both gunners dropped. That bought them another minute, maybe two. Behind her, Daniel's breathing had become labored, each breath a struggle. The exertion of fighting was draining what little reserves he had left. "Elena," he gasped, using her first name again. "If they overrun us before the helicopters arrive—" "Respectfully, sir," Elena cut him off without looking back. "Shut up and keep shooting." She switched to her M4 carbine as Taliban fighters pushed within 150 meters. The rifle barked in 3-round bursts, each burst finding a target. A fighter emerging from behind a rock. Down. 2 fighters trying to rush their position. Both down. The M4's rate of fire was keeping the enemy at bay, but her mental ammunition counter was dropping alarmingly fast. 90 rounds left. 75. 60. 15 minutes, she called out. 15 minutes until salvation or death. The Taliban knew it too. Their attacks were becoming more desperate, more aggressive. They could hear the helicopters in the distance now, a faint, rhythmic thumping growing gradually louder. The enemy commander was shouting orders, rallying his fighters for a final push before the Americans could extract their prize. A group of 6 fighters made a coordinated assault from 3 directions simultaneously, and Elena found herself spinning between targets, firing in controlled panic. Her M4 ran dry, and she dropped the magazine, slammed in a fresh one, charged the weapon, all in less than 3 seconds. Daniels was firing steadily beside her now, his pistol cracking away at targets of opportunity. They were fighting back to back, 2 warriors from different services, different backgrounds, united by a simple creed: never leave anyone behind. The helicopters were visible now, 2 black shapes racing across the night sky, their running lights off, flying dangerously low through the mountain passes. Elena keyed her radio. "Hayes, we are in heavy contact. Landing zone is hot. I say again, LZ is extremely hot." The response came back immediately, the sound of rotors nearly drowning out his voice. "Copy, we're coming in. 60 seconds. Those 60 seconds felt like an eternity. Elena fired her last M4 magazine, dropped it, and drew her sidearm, her final weapon. 15 rounds left. Daniels was down to his last magazine too. 45 rounds total between them. They'd held out this long, survived this much, and now it came down to seconds. A Taliban fighter appeared on top of the rocks above them, silhouetted against the stars, his AK-47 pointed down. Elena spun and fired twice. The fighter fell backward, tumbling into the darkness. Another rushed from the left, and Daniels shot him at point-blank range. They were everywhere now, the position being overrun, and still the helicopters came on. Then the valley exploded with the roar of minigun fire. The lead Black Hawk swept over their position, its door gunners laying down a wall of fire that tore through the Taliban fighters like a scythe through wheat. Tracers lit up the night, and the sound was apocalyptic. 6,000 rounds per minute pouring from each minigun, suppressing everything in a 180-degree arc. The second helicopter came in right behind it, and SEALs were fast roping down before it even stopped moving. Elena saw Hayes hit the ground, saw Pierce and Mitchell and the others forming a defensive perimeter. "We're here," Hayes shouted, sliding in beside them. "Let's get the commander out." Pierce, the team medic, was already working on Daniels, assessing his condition with practiced efficiency. "He's in bad shape," Pierce said grimly. "We need to move now." They rigged Daniels to a stretcher while Elena and the SEALs provided covering fire. The miniguns were still roaring, keeping the Taliban at bay, but RPG fire was starting to come back at them. One rocket streaked past the lead helicopter, missing by meters. "We're taking fire," the pilot called. "Need to extract now." Elena was nearly out of ammunition, 3 rounds left in her pistol. She fired them at a fighter trying to get an angle on the helicopter, then her slide locked back. Empty. Done. Daniels was being hoisted up to the helicopter now, Pierce going with him. Hayes grabbed Elena's arm. "Your turn. Move!" But Elena was scanning the battlefield, her tactical mind still working despite exhaustion. Then she saw it. A Taliban fighter had gotten into position with a perfect shot at the lead helicopter. He was shouldering an RPG, his finger moving to the trigger. The helicopter was 600 meters away. The fighter was 1,100 meters from Elena's position, and he was moving. It was an impossible shot, beyond impossible. But Elena Cross had made impossible shots before. She grabbed her sniper rifle, dropped when she'd switched to her pistol, and fell to one knee despite her exhaustion. Brought the scope to her eye. No time to range properly, no time to calculate wind drift. Just instinct and experience in a lifetime of shooting. All the hours with her father in the Nevada desert. All the training. All the combat missions. Everything distilled down to this single moment. She led the target impossibly far, accounting for his movement, for the bullet's flight time, for factors she didn't even consciously process. She fired. The rifle bucked one last time. 1,100 meters away, through darkness and chaos and impossible odds, the bullet found its mark. The fighter dropped. The RPG fell unfired from his hands. Hayes, who'd seen the shot, stopped dead and stared. "Holy shit, that's impossible." Elena calmly slung her empty rifle. "Marines don't do impossible. We just do what's necessary." Then she grabbed the rope and began climbing toward the helicopter, Hayes right behind her. The rope swung wildly as the Black Hawk banked hard to avoid incoming fire. Bullets cracked through the air around them. Taliban tracers created streaks of green light in the darkness. Below them, the valley floor fell away as the helicopter gained altitude, and Elena could see muzzle flashes from dozens of positions. The entire Taliban force was converging on them now, realizing their prize was slipping away. Hands grabbed her vest and pulled her into the helicopter's cabin. She collapsed onto the metal floor, gasping for breath, her muscles screaming from 48 hours of constant tension and exertion. Around her, the SEALs were still firing out the doors, their M4s adding to the cacophony. The minigun gunner was traversing his weapon in smooth arcs, hosing down enemy positions with devastating accuracy. "We're not clear yet," the pilot shouted over the intercom. "Taking heavy fire from multiple positions. We've got RPGs in the air." The helicopter jerked violently to the left as a rocket streaked close. Elena could feel the heat wash through the open door. The pilot was flying like a madman, jinking and weaving through the valley, using every trick in the book to keep them alive. Elena crawled over to where Daniels lay on the stretcher. Pierce was working frantically over him. The commander's face was gray, his breathing shallow and rapid, classic signs of shock. Pierce had two IV lines running, was squeezing a bag of fluid into Daniel's arm manually, trying to get his blood pressure up. "How is he?" Elena shouted over the noise. Pierce didn't look up from his work. "Alive, barely. If we don't get him to a surgeon in the next 20 minutes, we're going to lose him." Another RPG streaked toward them, and this time it was too close. The explosion rocked the helicopter. Shrapnel pinged off the armored hull. Alarms started blaring in the cockpit. "Engine 2 is damaged," the pilot called out. "We're losing power." The Black Hawk shuddered and began to lose altitude, dropping toward the valley floor in a controlled descent that was rapidly becoming uncontrolled. "Brace for impact," Hayes yelled. The SEALs grabbed whatever they could, forming their bodies as shields around Daniels and the critical equipment. Elena wedged herself against a bulkhead, her hand instinctively reaching for Daniels, finding it cold and clammy. The helicopter hit hard, bouncing once, twice, then sliding sideways across rocky ground in a shower of sparks and screaming metal. When they finally stopped, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then Hayes was shouting orders. "Everybody out! Secure a perimeter! Mitchell, Pierce, get the commander out now! Move, move, move!" The SEALs poured out of the crippled helicopter, weapons up, scanning for threats. The second Black Hawk was circling overhead, its miniguns providing covering fire, but it couldn't land. The landing zone was too hot, too small, surrounded by enemy fighters. They'd crashed in a dried riverbed, rocks and boulders on all sides, providing some cover but also limiting their movement options. Elena could see Taliban fighters moving on the ridgelines above them, at least 30 that she could count. Mitchell and Brooks were setting up a defensive perimeter, their weapons trained on the high ground. Wade was on the radio, calling for backup, for air support, for anything that could help. "We're pinned down," Hayes said, assessing their situation with brutal honesty. "Can't extract with the second bird, too much fire. Ground convoy would take hours to reach us, and we've got a critically wounded man who doesn't have ours." He looked at Elena, then at his team, seeing the same determination in every face. They'd come this far. They weren't giving up now. Elena had retrieved her sniper rifle from the crashed helicopter. Miraculously, it had survived intact. She climbed onto a boulder that gave her elevation and began scanning for targets. Even exhausted, even with her body running on pure adrenaline and willpower, she was still the best shot on this battlefield. She found an enemy machine gun team setting up on a ridge 800 meters away. Fired. The gunner dropped. His assistant tried to take over the weapon. She shot him too. "We need to buy time for air support to arrive," Hayes said, moving to her position. "How much ammo do you have left?" Elena checked her pouches. She'd grabbed extra magazines from the helicopter during the chaos. "Enough," she said simply. What she didn't say was that enough meant maybe 20 rounds. 20 rounds against 30-plus enemy fighters. The math didn't work in their favor. The Taliban were getting bolder now, seeing the Americans trapped and vulnerable. Groups of fighters were moving down from the ridgelines, using cover and concealment, advancing by bounds. Professional tactics from fighters who'd been at war their entire lives. Elena picked them off one by one, but for every one she dropped, 2 more appeared. It was like fighting the ocean. You might win individual battles, but the tide always came in. Daniels regained consciousness for a moment, his eyes finding Elena through his pain and fever. "Elena, the team, get them out." His voice was barely a whisper, each word an effort. Elena moved to his side, took his hand. "We're all getting out, sir. All of us. That's a promise." Daniels tried to smile but winced instead. "You're a terrible liar, Staff Sergeant." An explosion rocked their position, a mortar round landing 50 meters away. The Taliban had brought up indirect fire. The next one landed closer, 30 meters. They were walking the mortars in, adjusting their fire, and eventually they'd get a direct hit. "Air support!" Wade was yelling into the radio, his voice desperate. Where the hell is our air support? Then they heard it, a sound that every infantry soldier loves, a sound that means salvation is coming. The deep, throaty roar of an A-10 Warthog, the Air Force's premier close air support aircraft. The ugly, beloved plane swept over the valley at low altitude, and its GAU-8 Avenger 30mm rotary cannon opened up with a sound like the devil's zipper being pulled. The cannon spat out depleted uranium rounds at 3,900 rounds per minute, and wherever those rounds hit, nothing survived. Taliban positions on the ridgeline simply ceased to exist, torn apart by the withering fire. The A-10 made another pass, this time dropping precision-guided bombs on the mortar position. The explosions lit up the valley like daylight for a brief moment, and when Elena's vision cleared, the ridgelines were silent. The Taliban were either dead or running. "LZ is clear," the second Black Hawk pilot called. "Coming in now." The helicopter swept in fast, and before it even touched down, SEALs were loading Daniels aboard. Pierce never stopped working on him, maintaining the eye-vise, monitoring his vitals, fighting to keep their commander alive. Elena provided security, her rifle sweeping the perimeter, ready to engage any threat that appeared. A Taliban fighter appeared on a ridge, raising an RPG. Elena fired from the hip, an impossible shot that somehow connected. The fighter fell. Then hands grabbed her and pulled her aboard, and the helicopter was lifting, banking hard, accelerating out of the valley. As they cleared the ridgeline and the valley fell away behind them, Elena finally allowed herself to believe they might actually survive this. She looked at Daniels, at Pierce working over him, at the SEALs around her who'd risked everything to save their commander. This was what it meant to serve. This was what "leave no one behind" looked like when it stopped being a motto and became reality. "Hospital in 12 minutes, the pilot called back. Elena looked at Pierce, the unspoken question in her eyes. The medic met her gaze and gave the smallest nod. "He'll make it. He's tough. We'll get him there." 12 minutes. After everything they'd been through, Daniel's life came down to 12 more minutes. Elena closed her eyes, finally allowing exhaustion to wash over her. She'd walked 15 kilometers through enemy territory, held off dozens of Taliban fighters, made impossible shots, and helped rescue a man who'd become more than just a mission. Somewhere far behind them, the sun was beginning to rise over the Afghan mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of gold and pink. They'd survived the night against impossible odds, against overwhelming enemy forces, against logic and reason and tactical doctrine. They'd survived. And now they were going home. Epilogue: The Legacy. The Black Hawk touched down at Bagram Airfield at 0647 hours, and a full trauma team was waiting on the tarmac. The rotor blades were still spinning when doctors and nurses rushed forward, pulling Daniel's stretcher from the helicopter. Elena watched them run toward the field hospital, Pierce jogging alongside, still squeezing IV fluids, still fighting for every second. The last thing she saw before Daniels disappeared through the hospital doors was his hand, still moving, still fighting, still alive. Lieutenant Hayes stood beside her on the tarmac, both of them swaying with exhaustion. His uniform was torn and blood-stained, his face covered in dust and powder residue. Elena knew she looked no better. She hadn't slept in 56 hours, hadn't eaten a real meal in 3 days, and her body was running on fumes and willpower. "You did it," Hayes said quietly. "You actually did it. You walked into hell alone and brought him back." Elena shook her head slowly. "We did it, sir. Your team came when it mattered. That's what made the difference." But Hayes wasn't having it. "Staff Sergeant, I've been a SEAL for 8 years. I've worked with the best operators in the world. What you did, walking 15 clicks through enemy territory solo, keeping Daniels alive for 36 hours, making those shots, that's beyond anything I've ever seen. You're not just good, you're legendary." Colonel Briggs appeared, striding across the tarmac with his command sergeant major. Elena and Hayes snapped to attention despite their exhaustion. Briggs looked at them both, his expression unreadable. "At ease," he said finally. "Both of you. My office. Now." Elena felt her stomach drop. This was it. The consequences for launching an unauthorized mission, for disobeying orders, for putting lives at risk. In Briggs' office, the colonel sat behind his desk and studied them in silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he spoke. "What you two did was reckless, unauthorized, and violated about 6 different regulations. Lieutenant Hayes, you launched a rescue operation without clearance. Staff Sergeant Cross, you conducted a solo infiltration mission that should have gotten you killed." He paused, and Elena braced for the hammer to fall. "It was also," Briggs continued, his stern expression cracking into the smallest smile, "the most courageous thing I've seen in 30 years of service. Daniels is alive because you refused to leave him behind. The Navy is recommending both of you for Valor Awards. And Cross," he looked directly at her, "the Marine Corps is putting you in for the Navy Cross." Elena felt her knees go weak. The Navy Cross was the second highest military decoration for valor, behind only the Medal of Honor. "Sir, I was just doing my job," she said quietly. "Any Marine would have." Briggs cut her off with a raised hand. "No, Staff Sergeant, any Marine wouldn't have. Most couldn't have. You did something extraordinary, and you're going to accept the recognition with grace. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Elena said, though the thought of being decorated made her uncomfortable. She hadn't done this for medals or recognition. She'd done it because it was right, because Daniels had once saved her, because leaving people behind wasn't who she was. Marcus Daniels's surgery lasted 7 hours. The surgeons removed bone fragments from his shattered femur, repaired blood vessels damaged by the bullet, and debrided the massively infected tissue from both wounds. They pumped him full of broad-spectrum antibiotics and gave him 4 units of blood to replace what he'd lost. When he finally woke up 36 hours later, the first face he saw was his wife Kate's. She was crying and laughing simultaneously, hitting his good shoulder with gentle punches while tears streamed down her face. "Don't you ever do that to me again, Marcus Daniels. Do you hear me? Never again." Daniels, still groggy from anesthesia, managed a weak smile. "Yes, ma'am, I promise." Their daughter Lily was there too, climbing carefully onto the hospital bed, wrapping her small arms around her father's neck. "Daddy, you're home. The Marine lady brought you home." 3 months later, the California sun was brilliant over Camp Pendleton, and a crowd of Marines and SEALs filled the parade ground for the award ceremony. Elena Cross stood at attention in her dress blues, deeply uncomfortable with all the eyes focused on her. She tried to decline the ceremony twice, but the Marine Corps had insisted. Her parents had flown in from Nevada, and she could see her mother crying in the front row, holding a photo of Tyler in his Marine uniform. The citation was read aloud, describing her actions in clinical military language that somehow failed to capture the reality of walking alone through enemy territory, of holding off dozens of fighters with limited ammunition, of keeping Daniels alive against impossible odds. For extraordinary heroism and inspiring valor in the face of the enemy, Staff Sergeant Elena Cross conducted a solo rescue mission deep behind enemy lines, sustained the life of Commander Daniels for 36 hours under constant enemy contact, eliminated 17 enemy combatants, and enabled the successful extraction of SEAL Team 7. Her actions were in keeping with the highest traditions of the Marine Corps and the United States Naval Service. Then Commander Marcus Daniels walked across the parade ground to pin the Navy Cross on her uniform. He was in his service dress blues, walking with only a slight limp. A miracle considering the doctors had initially said he'd never walk properly again. Daniels had proven them wrong through sheer determination and months of brutal physical therapy. He'd refused to accept anything less than full recovery. He took the Navy Cross from its velvet case, and Elena could see his hands were steady and sure. He pinned it on her uniform, then stepped back and saluted. Elena returned the salute crisply, and the crowd erupted in applause. But Daniels wasn't done. He turned to address the assembled Marines and SEALs, his voice carrying across the parade ground. I've served in combat for 17 years. I've worked with Army Rangers, Air Force PJs, Marine Force Recon, and the best SEALs the Navy has ever produced. I thought I knew what courage looked like. I thought I understood what it meant to be a warrior. He paused, looking directly at Elena. But what Staff Sergeant Cross did goes beyond courage, beyond heroism, beyond anything I've ever witnessed. He gestured to the SEALs of Team 7 standing in formation. She walked 15 clicks through enemy territory alone to save a man she barely knew. She held off dozens of enemy fighters for 36 hours with limited ammunition and supplies. She made shots that were literally impossible, shots that saved not just my life, but the lives of my entire team. His voice grew stronger. She carried me out of hell on her back, and she did it without hesitation, without complaint, without asking for anything in return. Daniels held up a unit patch, showing a female sniper with angel wings and the words, "Protected by Saint Elena," embroidered below. These men have adopted a new motto. They wear this patch on their uniforms as a reminder that heroes come in all forms, and that the most legendary warriors don't always carry a trident. The crowd laughed, and Elena felt herself blushing furiously. Staff Sergeant Cross will tell you she was just doing her job, Daniels continued, that any Marine would have done the same thing. But we all know the truth. What she did, no one else could have done. She is the finest warrior I've ever had the honor to serve with, and I owe her my life. After the ceremony, Elena found herself sitting alone near the parade ground, looking out at the Pacific Ocean. The waves rolled in with eternal rhythm, and she thought about Tyler, about the promise she'd made at his funeral, about her father Elias teaching her to shoot in the Nevada desert, about the long road that had led her here. Daniels found her there and sat down without speaking. They'd both seen too much, done too much to need words. The ocean rolled on. Finally, Daniels broke the silence. "What are you going to do now, Staff Sergeant?" Elena was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know, sir, after everything." She trailed off. Daniels nodded, understanding without explanation. "Combat changed you. Some things you could never unsee." "My daughter Lily wants to meet you properly," he said, shifting topics. "She drew you a picture. A woman in a cape with a big rifle, saving people. She wants to be like you when she grows up." Elena smiled genuinely for the first time in weeks. "I'd like that, sir, to meet her properly." Daniel stood to leave, then turned back. "Elena, and I'm using your first name because we're off duty and because you saved my life. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the chance to watch my daughter grow up, to grow old with Kate, to have a life. That's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." Elena looked up at this legendary SEAL commander who had survived the impossible. "You would have done the same for me, sir. That's what makes us who we are." Daniel smiled. "Maybe, but you actually did it, and that makes all the difference." Years later, when people asked Staff Sergeant Elena Cross about that night in Afghanistan, she always gave the same answer. "I did what any Marine would do. We don't quit, and we don't leave our people behind." But everyone who'd been there knew the truth. What she did wasn't what any Marine would do. It was what the best Marine, at her absolute finest, could do. The legend spread, the female sniper who'd walked alone into enemy territory and brought back a SEAL commander. Young women enlisted because of her. Scout sniper schools evolved their training. SEAL Team 7 never forgot, still wearing the patch with the angel wings sniper. A reminder that heroes are real, that courage knows no gender, and that the greatest warriors are measured not by how many enemies they kill, but by how many friends they save. Elena went on to train the next generation, passing on not just shooting skills, but values, duty, honor, and the absolute refusal to leave anyone behind. She taught at Marine sniper schools, shared her father's lessons about patience and precision, and made sure that every student understood that excellence wasn't about beating someone else. It was about beating who you were yesterday. And somewhere in California, a girl named Lily Daniels grew up knowing that a Marine named Elena had given her father back to her. That heroes walked among us. That one person, in the right moment, with enough courage, could change everything. The sun set over Camp Pendleton, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Elena stood and walked back toward the barracks, the Navy Cross heavy on her chest, but her heart light. She'd done her duty. She'd honored Tyler's memory. She'd honored her father's lessons. She'd proven that Marines keep their promises. And she'd brought Marcus Daniels home.